stop me at any.
Thank you so much, Selma. We're really honored to have you, Selma, this afternoon. I mean, it's great to have you, and thank you so much for being willing to talk to our students. I mean, those lovely students, I'm sure you will feel the positive vibes they have and the energy they have. Some of them already started writing, and some of them really, you will discover their talents as we go. But I would like to thank you so much, Selma, for your time. Just a bit of background. Selma is a British Palestinian writer, or if you like to say Palestinian British, it doesn't matter. And she writes about Palestine. Her first novel was Out of It. That's the name of the novel. And it was published in 2012. And the novel was reviewed in different parts of the world, including the UK, the US, and the Middle East. Several people reviewed the novel, talking about the novel and how they received it. It was nominated as a Guardian Book of the Year, and in 2024, it was on the top of the list of the Guardian of 5 best books to explain Israel, Palestine, talking about particularly about Gaza. So hopefully we'll hear from Selma about Out of It, about the background to it, about how she went on writing it. And as people from inside Gaza, we always feel that any form of writing, any narrative, any story, any podcast, any piece, any article that talks about Gaza and highlights the life in Gaza and the details of life in Gaza, we view all this work and effort as great because it amplifies the voice of the people whose voice is not heard. So, Selma, thank you so much. I'll leave the space for you to tell us about yourself, if you don't mind, your writing, your background, because I'm sure this talk will be a turning point in many of the attendants or the viewers later, turning point in their life in terms of trying to take writing as a path for the future and sharing stories with the world. Selma, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ahmed and Martin and George and Fatima and Mara, I can see here today. It's a real honor to be in conversation with you. I wish that we were able to have this conversation in person. I wish I could be in Gaza to speak with you. وكمان أنا يعني I wish يا ريت أن ممكن نحكي بالعربي بس عربي تبعي يعني مكسر وغريبة وآسف. It's a big sorrow in my life that my Arabic is not as good as I would like it to be. My mother is English. My dad is from Jaffa. He's a Nakba Palestinian. You know, he experienced the story that is familiar to very many of you, which is, when he was age 10, he was hit by a grenade. And as a result of that, the whole family left, and they went to the West Bank, then they went to Syria, then a lot went to Kuwait. One of my uncles was very smart. He got Kuwaiti nationality, so he started sort of helping to invest in the family. And he gave my dad an option that he could either go and study in Egypt and, in his words, live like a king, or he could come to England and have no money at all. And my father was just determined to come to England for some reason. Anyway, my parents met here, and they've been married now for almost 65 years. They're very, very different. Their backgrounds are very different. They both traveled a lot in their lives. And I think this coming from 2 very different cultures has really informed a lot of my writing, because as children, we've always been trying to translate one person to the other person in these different ways of looking at the world and these different experiences. I always wanted to write, but my father I think partly because he's Palestinian, he has this feeling, they can take everything from you, but they can't take your education. So for him, education was the most important thing. And we're three girls, and my older sister, he decided she should become an architect. Because she was quite artistic and mathematical. I was to become a lawyer, and my younger sister a doctor. And that's it. That's what we've done. We all went on vocational courses. We're all got lots of professions, lots of degrees. But I didn't even dare to start writing fiction until I was in my early 30s. And I started writing when I was living in Bahrain. I married a Palestinian. So, I mean, somebody who has always connected me to Gaza is maybe I'm jumping a bit ahead, because the work that I did as a lawyer, I did a law degree in this country, and then it was at the time, I'm 55, at the time, the first Intifada was going on in the West Bank, in Palestine. And I had read the work of Raja Shahadi, who is, as you know, he's a very, very fine writer, but he's also a lawyer who had set up Al-Haq. And I was really impressed by his writing, and it really spoke to me because having grown up in Kuwait, Kuwait was invaded by Iraq in 1990. And for me, I was nearly 20. I was 20 in 1990. That period of time, living somewhere where there was an invasion. It was the first time. I've had a very privileged life, I know that, but it was the first time that politics sort of entered my home. And I realized in a very first-hand way what it meant to be Palestinian, in terms of all of my father's family were made to leave Kuwait, and some of them had been born there, they'd lived there for 40 years, and they had to move to Jordan and to other places. Some got trapped with papers where they couldn't go anywhere. I mean, there were no countries that would accept them because they had refugee papers. So this was a politicizing event for me. So when I got my law degree, everybody else on my law course was going to become corporate lawyers, pretty much. But I went to the West Bank. I was 22, and I had nobody in my family had been back, right? My broader family. And it was very strange to enter Palestine because in my family's minds in Kuwait, they always saw it as this sort of mystical, beautiful, untouchable paradise that was denied to us. And it was so sort of idealized and kind of unreal that when I actually took a bus from Egypt into Palestine, I almost thought that the bus might sort of like fall off a cliff or something. I felt that I was entering into a completely different world. Anyway, the experience I had when I lived in Jerusalem, and I managed to get a job with a human rights organization there called the Palestine Human Rights Information Center. The experience had working with the Palestinians really like affected me, forever. I mean, I think I had so much respect for them in terms of the way that they pulled together, in the way that they would support each other, in the professionalism towards their work. And it was a really special organization that I worked for. And I also felt very connected to the landscape. And I felt I'd found this is it, I'd found my sort of purpose in life. I think a lot of a lot of young people, they're not really sure what they wanted to do. But that for me, that was my point when I kind of realized where I wanted to be. Sorry, this is a lot of background, but I couldn't stay there. When I left, the Israelis wouldn't let me back in again, and then I kept trying, but I couldn't get back in, so I ended up living in Cairo. And then when I left Cairo, I met a guy who was at school with me in Kuwait, who you probably know or have heard of, which is Ghassan Abu Sitta, who was in my school, and he's very much connected to Gaza. And through him, I met a man, Abdullah, who I ended up marrying. And we were a gang in London, okay? So we were like the Palestinian house in London, and we were all very committed. It was the time of the Oslo process. And although we were very critical of the peace process, we still had this kind of idea that maybe some of our friends were going back to Gaza, And we kind of with this idea that we could go back with our skills and help, rebuild. That was our plan. And we were looking at the UN possibly because they had a program with the UNDP for diaspora Palestinians to return. So we were thinking of maybe doing that. Then that didn't work out for various reasons. And my then husband, Abdullah, got a job in Bahrain. So I moved to Bahrain. So this takes me to the time when I started writing. Bahrain for me was a place where I couldn't really engage with my work in terms of the type of work I wanted to do. In England, I'd been doing civil actions against the police, so a lot of work against state authorities for unlawful arrest and detention of the mainly Afro-Caribbean communities of London. And in Bahrain, I couldn't do anything like that. And I was working for a telecom company, and I was feeling very restless in terms of where I wanted to put my energies. And so for me, writing, I was trying to recapture the stories and the sense of community and the sense of our story that I felt I hadn't really read about it very much in English. There was not very much literature on Palestine available at the time. There's a lot more now, but back then there was very little. And then I had this grand idea, um, which came from something I'd read by Edward Said, where Edward Said was saying nobody has written the grand Palestinian story, the epic story, like all the generations, that we haven't really had it. We need that kind of book. We're sort of culturally impoverished without it. So I thought, okay, I've got this time and I've got some ability. I'm going to write that book, which is a bit, arrogant and everything. But when I started to do it, I actually found that I felt a little bit like, I don't want to say this, but a little bored by the idea of going back to, back to 1948 again. I'd read this story in a lot of memoirs. I actually felt that where I wanted to be was closer to the energies of the time. And it was around 2003, which was the second bombardment of Iraq. And we were in Bahrain, so it felt very close. And I had this image in my head about like a young man on a roof who's feeling very uh, disenfranchised and restless. And there was a bomber plane going on top, flying ahead over him. And I just didn't know. I wanted to capture this person who's very educated, very like aware of the West, but the West has no awareness at the time of him. And I wanted to be in that sort of capture that energy somewhere. And then it took me a while to think about like, where do I want to put this man? Where is this story going to be set? And it could have been like, in the camps in Lebanon, or it could have been in the West Bank. But I decided on Gaza, which I'd only visited twice, very briefly, because when I had studied doing my master's, the situation of Palestinians around the world, I really felt that Gaza was like the most extreme situation for Palestinians in terms of the youth of the population, the nature of the siege, and yeah, and I just felt that that's naturally where this story needs to be set. So then I started creating a sort of fictional Gaza, which was like I had a map and I said, okay, I want my family to be here and I want the seas here and there's a camp here and there's a town and I wanted to capture, and then I just researched and I read a lot of articles, a lot of interviews. I watched a lot of documentaries to try to get this world to be as alive for me as possible. And I also was interested in the idea about we as Palestinians, we're so divided, right? Everywhere across, we're in lots of different countries. In the West Bank now, if you live in Jenin, it's difficult to go to Qalqilia. If we're just constantly, deliberately being split apart with lots of pieces of paper in our hand, lots of borders between us, different languages that we're speaking. What is the thing that connects us, right? And I was thinking, when I was looking at doing this novel and all the reading I've been doing, I thought the one thing that connects us, that makes us very distinctive as a people, is this idea of a continuing political injustice that we have a very strong emotional relationship to. And that was the way that I wanted to plug into it in terms of the pulse of the book. Like, how do we relate to this cause? How much do we want to give our time and our energies to it? How much choice do we have about that? Even with some of my characters, I have them coming to London, but even in London, when they're trying to find this sort of space of freedom, everyone's expecting something of them because they're Palestinian. They want them to behave in a certain way and to have a, you know, and and I just wanted to explore how that sort of felt for a variety of family, for a variety of characters from the same family. And I also wanted to show little bits of Palestinian history. So I had certain points I wanted to bring into this. And so um, that was a sort of foundation for the novel. And it took me so long to write it. I'm a really, really slow writer of novels. I spend, honestly, and I don't know that my writing, for all of you who start, I don't know that my writing of a first draft has really improved very much from when I started 20 years ago. But what has improved a lot for me is how much I rewrite. And this is a really, really important part of it. So when you're writing, try with your mind to, like, they talk about the left hand and right side of your brain. One part is free and imaginative, and you have to just let that go. And you might be producing stuff on paper which is awful. I mean, if you wanted to, like, really torture me, you would make me read some of the first drafts of things I've written. But it's then you come back and you think, okay, 90% of this is rubbish, but there's a bit here. I think this scene really works. And then you take that piece and you just work around that. Or you write something much broader and you find a strand, a storyline that really interests you. So, yeah, so the novel is basically, it's set between, it starts in Gaza, then it goes to London, then it goes to the Gulf, then it goes back to London, then it ends up in Gaza. And in terms of the differences between Palestinian people, at the time with the Oslo Accords, I was thinking there's this really unliked group of people who are the children. I mean, the Palestinian Authority had come back to Gaza and it wasn't popular as far as I could tell. But I felt, what does it feel like to be the child of somebody whose parents are identified with politics that you don't agree with or like, right? So it's not your fault, but you're associated with that family. And also for some of these children going back, they'd come from these very, like, affluent backgrounds in the West, some going to international schools. So I thought I'm going to take, like, an extreme idea about what it means to be a Palestinian, quite an unpopular one, and to just sort of see that world from the outside. The other thing that's very useful when you're writing, because I know, because I write in English, I know a lot of my writing is going to be read by people who understand very little. And it's very important to try to make sure that they're connected with the story, and any information you're giving them about the setting and the politics is natural to that story, because you're creating a sort of dream world that they're in with the characters. And if you suddenly stop and you say, okay, I'm now going to give you a little lecture about what happened in 48 and 67, you're going to break up that sense of, that sort of continuous dream that you want them to be in. But what is useful with having somebody coming in from the outside is like a visitor. And this also works with a child. If you have a narrator who's a child, is that they don't understand the political complexities. So they're trying to figure it out and they're observing a lot more than somebody who's been living with it, right? So that's partly why I had these outsider people coming in. And I also wanted to I really wanted to capture this sense of energy and youth. So I kept my chapters really short and my sentences short, and I made sure that it was, chronologically moving forward at pace. Each section is in a sort of 18-hour period. So if you can find the more ways possible to compress your story, because that puts a sort of a little bit of pressure on everything and it makes the characters and actions sort of knock against each other that little bit more. I think that's a good thing to try to do. Um, but with that book, I'd never even talked to anybody about wanting to write. The internet wasn't as developed, there wasn't as much content on it. But when I was in Bahrain, what happened, and this is something you can do anywhere in the world, you can do this for Ghazi, and it's really freeing. If you want, I found some short story competitions, and they all have different rules to them about the length of the story, the theme of the story, when the submission deadline, etc. And you can enter these. Most of them are free. Or sometimes they have a small fee attached to them. And you have to look at the judges, make sure that the judges are sort of reputable. Some of them are a little bit, they're a little dubious. But if you find the prestigious ones, do some research. And then I was sending in these short stories. And what is really liberating about that is that they didn't know where I was from. They didn't know if I was male or female. They didn't know my age. They didn't know my religion, nothing, right? So you can really have fun with being anyone you want to be and inhabiting that body and being judged just according to your writing, nothing else. And that I had some success with my first short stories. I had a lot of rejection as well, and that's a big part of writing. But I'm quite obsessed with Excel spreadsheets. So I would have like a little chart, and I'd see, okay, when is the deadline, how many words, and I put all that information in, and when do I prepare it by? And then I would send it in, and I basically had a success rate of about 1 in 7 of my entries might get shortlisted or a finalist or something like that. So it's quite a high rejection level, but you just have to get used to that and then just keep improving. But it was enough with those short stories for me to be able to get an agent and eventually to get out of it published. And at the time, writing as a Palestinian in English was, you know, it was really not easy. I mean, and I can feel that um I know sometimes that I was censored. People would tell me that my work was not going through because I was Palestinian. Those kind of things, they probably still happen now, but they happen less. And when the novel went to be published, it got rejected. Like, even though my agent was a very important one, it got rejected like a lot. And what and then it was picked up by Bloomsbury Qatar Foundation Press, this publishing house in Qatar. And since then, it's had this sort of, it's never been like a bestseller, and writing has not been something that, has ever sort of been something I've made, it's never been a lucrative thing for me. But it has, what I've been happy about with that novel is I feel it's sort of tracked along and found its own audience that it really resonates with. And to me, because I think that that's a big thing about literature, is the communication and the feeling that you're not so alone with your experience of the world. And I've had so many people Palestinians in diaspora and otherwise, in Palestine, who've really, felt seen these characters, they could feel the world through them. I think I should stop there for a little second. Does anyone have any questions? I feel I've been talking quite a lot.
It's lovely hearing those details. But any questions, guys, so far?
I saw something in a chat. Sorry, I can't read the chats while I'm reading. Hello, Shuru. Hello, Mara. What's IUG? Mara says, I'm here from IUG.
Yeah, it happens that we may have some students from IUG or Al-Azhar University. So welcome,
Where's
Marah.
Islamic University, yes.
Yeah, IUG Islamic
Yeah, yeah.
University. That's right.
The beginnings are always difficult. Yes. Thank you. Well, if anyone, do you want me to just, I can.
Roba has got a question. Roba, go ahead.
Hi, Roba.
Hi, it's such a pleasure to be here and to hear you talk, and I love your writings. I have just one question so far. When it comes to being labeled as a writer at the very beginning of your journey, was it like a heavy thing to deal with? Like, because a lot of people tend to criticize or just do such things to new writers or new poets, and they might get so overwhelmed by the label because they might get so much criticized, even though they are just in their beginning. So, how did you deal with such thing?
That's such an excellent question. It's so nice to hear your voice. No, I think a lot of, I mentioned a bit about like rewriting as being something you get better with. I think also the confidence to be able to say, I have a voice that's worth hearing took me a very long time. And I think, I mean, for me, it was on many levels that I felt that I wasn't really the right person to be able to call myself a writer, particularly on this subject matter. I was very self-conscious of the fact that I was writing about a place where I didn't live, and and I felt that people might say I had no right to do that, and what did I understand about Gaza, for example? And that's why it was very, very wonderful and encouraging of Ahmed to say that the writing from outside about Gaza is appreciated and considered important because I was I was very I kind of had a bit of an imposter syndrome. Also, a lot of writers, I think, by their nature, are quite introverted, maybe quite shy, maybe not the most confident of personalities, because a lot of what interests them is to do with observing from the outside. So when people and I remember having a couple of people sort of like semi laughing at me in my 20s when I said I wanted to be a writer. And even though they probably don't remember that at all, it really froze me for many years from even trying. So I would say just disregard that. It's probably better to just keep it as a private thing. The amazing thing about the internet now is that you can communicate your work out without having to tell your whole friendship group if they're not being, or your family, if they're not being particularly supportive. And and then something else I've been, you know, becoming a little bit more vocal about now that I'm older, that I think back on from when I was younger, is that there's this issue, and I find this a lot, Palestine, it's very strong on this, is that the voices of Palestinians have constantly been discredited, right? We're always being thought to be like, I mean, the Zionist idea was that this is a people without a land. I mean, sorry, that they were a people without a land, that this land was uninhabited. And part of the idea underscoring that is that even if there are people, they're not people of with complex interior lives. They're not people whose voices count. So when during the mandate period, all of the committees which were set up, there was very little space for Arab voices to participate in those. And you find that, at conferences in the West here, that often and it's shifting a little bit thanks to things like Black Lives Matter movement. But you have this assumption that it is better for somebody who is not a Palestinian to speak for the Palestinians, and then they will be believed. And we're really trying to fight against this to say you have to listen to our voices. But I think it's made me recognize how much I internalized for so long this idea that anything I said would be discredited because as a Palestinian, I was seen to be partisan, overly passionate, not really like able to give an objective viewpoint. Okay. Um, and that's one area of kind of discrimination that I've become a lot stronger in pushing back on. But it's, I'm probably at least twice your age. Then the other area is just being a woman is there's often an assumption, and every society, every cultural group, this varies a lot, but you are not really, and this hit me most strongly when I got pregnant with my first child, was that I felt I had studied so much, I had worked so much up until that point where I became pregnant. And then suddenly at that point, nobody seemed to think that I had an opinion that was worth hearing. I mean, it was like I just became something about becoming a mother seemed to negate my cerebral capacity. And I think it also made me think about the way that as women, we're often encouraged to be quite pleasing and conciliatory and supportive. And sometimes when you're writing, you have to be critical, and you have to express your emotions. And if you're coming from a place where you've been told to sort of keep them down, it's a little bit, tricky to get that confidence together. But it means that when you write, you're probably checking yourself that little bit more, which can make the quality of the writing better. So I'd just say to you that it took me a long time to say I'm a writer, I mean, I remember I've got this wonderful friend, Azel Hassan, who's a filmmaker. And she phoned me when I was living in Bahrain and she said, "Are you working?" And I said, "No, I haven't been in the office for, not since my child was born." And then I said later on, I said, "But I've written like 4 short stories." And she said, "That's what I mean when I say, have you been working? I mean, are you writing?" But for me, it was sort of like the writing was my pleasure thing, and the work was the office. And I think to make that transition, that my work, and I'm still not 100% on this, but my work is my writing, that the sooner that you can get to that and be comfortable with that, the better. And if people aren't being supportive enough, maybe question them, maybe also question a little bit why they might be saying that, and tell them, look, I need support right now. This is something that means a lot to me, and see how that goes down. I'm just going to look at this other question here. Sorry, I'm just looking at this is so this is a question about Ruba. This is a question about um your freedom. Yeah, yeah. Yes, I mean, I completely hear you. I mean, I encourage you to be as free as you feel safe to be free. And I think, but, and I think what makes a lot of Palestinian literature so interesting today is that we're a people which have a lot of sort of compulsion within ourselves and put upon us to tell the narrative, right? To tell the legal and the moral justification for our cause. And I agree that this is incredibly important, but I think with writing, Palestinian writing now, in some ways it's become because there are more writers, there are more artists, and because the nature of our oppression has been going on for so long, there's a recognition for the need to see the, you know, see the beauty in a moment which is not overtly political. So to not have to be like, what's the word? Like harnessed to the narrative on all occasions, and to tell personal stories or domestic stories or science fiction stories or wherever your imagination wants to go. There's I mean, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but there's I always think about, there was a poem by Pablo Neruda, who is a Chilean poet, and he said something about, during the violence in Chile, he said something like, "How can I write about the beauty of the mountain or the flower when the blood of children runs in the streets?" And I completely I completely understand that. But at the same time, I feel that we've been going through this for so long that it's like, if we're living this, does that mean that we can never enjoy the beauty of the mountain or the sea or the flowers or the love of a family, that we have to find these spaces because it's important for us and for our it's just to sustain, to have us to have the fullest human experience possible. We need these spaces, and that's what the artist can do, and that's what the artist can communicate. And there's this writer, I've just read a novel by a Trinidadian writer. She's not particularly well known. She's called Celeste Muhammad. And I loved this book because it was the characters, nobody had, you could look at it in a picture, in a photograph, and say, well, nobody here has, much money. Their houses are decrepit, there's a bit of crime and violence, and things are really bad. But she made the whole scene there, these characters, so vivid and heroic and funny and witty and resourceful. And, you just wanted to be with them because I felt I was learning so much from these characters. So I think what has to talk about this point in time, and I was kind of hoping with this webinar that it would allow you to have a point in time where you're not having to think about everything outside too much. But I think with this point in time, what has got, and I've been on so many demonstrations here in London, hundreds and thousands and millions of people on the street, are some of the messages coming from Gaza, which are so authentic, so absolutely heartfelt. And there are so many individuals, young individuals that we're following on social media who have been so polite and so some funny and creative and witty, and I don't know, that it's just been, I think that's really got through to people a lot. And I think that um that the authenticity of your work is the most important thing, because then it's sort of ringing true, and it will ring true to other people. And with this Trinidadian writer, I mean, hearing her speaking about writing this book, she had to ask a lot of her great aunts and her, other members of the family stories about what it was like for them to be, to be young or to be married very young, or things that they found a bit shameful. And she said, you just have to kind of get through some of those levels of shame. And sometimes to get that sort of, that really true story that really means a lot to you. I hope that's kind of a long-winded answer. I speak in a very, I don't know. I write in the same way as well. I go all over the place. I'm sorry if that's not quite. Um, but I actually on one point about sort of this idea of how we put across the narrative, I really feel now that for so long, and I've just heard that the Israelis are putting another, I think it's 150 million or 250 million into Hasbara and propaganda campaigns and stuff. But I do think that they're losing. I think that there is a lot of it is coming across for those people smart enough to be able to see through it, or anyone who is spending the time to look at it carefully. It's coming across as very formulaic, very lacking in empathy, really hateful, and I don't think it's something that inspires people. Whereas there's this quote from a philosopher called Wittgenstein, who was talking about beauty, which is, and the idea that beauty, when presented, inspires in the viewer the desire to replicate it. So, in terms of creating something of beauty that may not seem altogether relevant to the situation, it is relevant if it inspires replication, particularly if it's sort of capturing the things around you that you can still manage to find beautiful despite everything. And there's a question from Fatima here. Sorry. What's the biggest challenge that we may face as Palestinian writers, especially if we want to write it to the Western world to correct some uncorrected beliefs about Palestinian lives? So also excellent question. I must say, I think, Fatima, I think a lot of the battles have been fought in terms of being able to get Palestinian writing and writers and voices to a larger audience. I think it's a lot easier now than it was before. And I think that even in the last couple of years, there are places where I used to just automatically expect I would be edited, I would be challenged, I would have people politically trying to water me down. It's just not happening as much anymore. So I think a lot of the truths are coming out. They're not coming out as 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 they're being resisted, but I think this is part of the reason why there are all these clampdowns on university spaces, and restrictions there. So if you want me to talk about the restrictions being faced, I could talk about, well, in this country, I sometimes think we have two big barriers on either side of which we can't really, we need to be careful to avoid, and they're policed by legislation, so they are legally enforced. One of them is anti-Semitism and the increasingly expanding definition as to what that is, which includes a criticism of Zionism in its most extreme form. Now, if those definitions go through, then it becomes very difficult to criticize Israel, and you could be criminalized for doing so. That hasn't happened yet, and I'm involved with legal groups who are trying to stop this from happening. But that is one sort of barrier. That means I try to always make it very, very clear that this distinction of being anti-Zionist as a philosophical belief, as something that I uphold as my right to be anti-Zionist and for X, Y, and Z reason. And when I'm speaking or if asked, to make it very clear that that this is nothing anti-Jewish, that there were Jewish populations in Palestine, that there are lots of very active Jewish people within the movement for Palestine. It's nothing to do with religion. This is about a philosophical belief. So that is one thing. That is one great barrier that you have to avoid. You have to just navigate it carefully and make sure that the distinction is clear in your head and you're aware of the restrictions. The other one is to do with terrorism. And in this country, both the civil and the political wings of Hamas are deemed to be terrorist organizations. So you have to be extremely careful when you talk about political parties. The US has gone further in terms of some of its prescriptions of other political parties like the PFLP and even human rights groups that I work with, like Al-Haq. So there are these creeping, well, quite attempts to close down on freedom of expression. And this obviously affects whether it's as a chill factor, that you feel that you have to be careful writing about these areas, which you definitely do have to be careful. It doesn't mean that you necessarily are watering down your political line, whatever it is that you believe in. Personally, because I come from a human rights international law background, I take that as my bar on everything, because that's quite hard to argue against. And that should be the minimum standard. And that that does get people quite confused to be able to, because it's suddenly in this situation where the Palestinians as a group who've been defined as terrorists for a very, very long time en masse are now the ones who are calling for international law. And it is, the British government who is taking huge, going to lengths to undercut it systematically. So I would say, as a political framework, just be aware of that. It also means, and you see this on social media, like, the way that social media accounts can be taken down and that certain words can be trigger the algorithm. And then what people have done is they've created, other signs, or they've used a little letter so that that word doesn't trigger the algorithm. And it's this really high degree of creativity that you're seeing on social media messaging and memes, etc., to get around the algorithms. And in a way, I think with Palestinian literature and art and writing, what's so extraordinarily like innovative and exciting about it is that we're constantly trying to think of ways to get around restrictions that we do not believe are in line with our own ideas of natural justice, freedom of expression, and international law. So just be vigilant, be careful, be clear on your own political thinking, and be creative. And one book which I really liked in this respect, which is, it's written by a Palestinian from Jerusalem called Yasmin Zaher, and it's set in New York, right? It only came out last year and it won some prizes. It's set in New York, and it's a young woman who's very dressy and she likes shopping. And you start to read it and you think, what on earth has this got to do with Palestine? And she's really gone sort of like way out in terms of not mentioning Palestine very much. But then it starts cropping up a little bit. But also, what I think is really brilliant about this book is it's actually Yasmin, in my reading of it, it's Yasmin looking at American society and saying, look at how you treat the main character is a teacher in a school where most of the students are Black Americans. She's looking at the workings of racism. She's looking at the poverty. She's looking at the discrimination and the way it affects these kids. And she's kind of, it's that feeling of like, what I liked about it in terms of opening the what's it called? Opening the horizon as to what Palestinian writers can write about, is that it's basically saying we can comment on anything. Our voices are valid. Our views are important. We are more resourceful. We have community in a way that you don't, and being able to look out. So that's one example. And then, you know, even in the more traditional Palestinian writing, like with Emil Habibi and Said the Pesoptimist, there's a lot of like, you know, crazy, fantastical stuff going on there, you know, and a lot of like drawing from European influences like Voltaire. So take your influences wherever you want. They don't have to just be from Palestinian literature. If you feel more inspired by, I don't know, Isabel Allende or I don't know. I'd really be interested in what you're reading at the moment. Does anyone want to let me know what they're reading or anything about what they'd quite like to write if um any
You have any question, guys? But in the meantime, if you want to prepare your question, you would like to write it in the chat box, or if you want to unmute and ask your question, I would like to ask this question because it's in relation to what you've mentioned, Selma, regarding Yasmin's writing. So you've seen it from that perspective. You had your own reading of Yasmin Zahir's book. I was going to ask about Out of It. Now, it was set in the Second Intifada, but whenever, and this is personal experience, honestly, whenever you attempt to write something, you always have that worry of the fact that your writing is tied exclusively to a particular point of time, a particular historical moment. And if you come up, publish it at that particular point of time, then it loses its kind of impact or relevance. I mean, in that particular work, I haven't finished reading the novel, but I feel that the themes are still relevant today, even after like almost a decade of writing your novel. It feels that the themes are relevant to what is happening in Gaza, regardless of the time it was written. And my question is, what narrative strategies did you use or do you recommend for writers or beginning writers or novice writers to ensure that their writing keeps that momentum and keeps that relevance to, I don't want to say time, but keeps that relevance regardless of the time it was written in order to ensure that it is written in a time maybe later than that particular historical point of time that probably the work was published then.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for your close reading of of the book, and I'm really glad that it feels like it's withstood the test of time. And that was something I wrestled with a lot, because you want your characters to be able to move freely in a you want them to be able to move freely, and you don't want them to be too easily identifiable. And when you've got something like, you know, like if I was talking about the PA in Gaza, I didn't want people to say, oh, are you talking about that character and that incident? Are you criticizing that family? So I think one thing is try to make them a composite, you know, like if you're thinking of one particular character, and you're afraid they might be one particular person, change one feature of them that's on the character level, like make them tall if they're short, give them red hair if they're dark, you know, just something so that they're altered around a little bit in your head, and that will give you a certain difference to them. Your more profound question than that is really the one which is more to do with how do you capture a theme. Get the theme, don't get that detail of that one moment, you know. And if you feel that that one moment is really relevant, is really the story you want to tell, think very hard about why that moment projects out on so many other incidences that you want to talk about, so that it's not, and try, and this is really hard with writing about a situation which is there are so many different layers of laws and restrictions and incidents and divisions, etc. Try to think of general trends within them so that you have enough nuance, but the reader doesn't get lost in the detail. And if you ever get to the point where you feel, in my early drafts, I had big chunks which were almost like explaining, like, this is what happened in 1967, or this, a particular event. When I was rewriting, I had a rule which was like anything that doesn't add to the plot or to the character has to just go because it's going to weigh down the book and I'm going to lose readers. I'm going to not let they're not going to carry through. It has to be adding to the emotional strength of the character or the way that the plot is moving. And if it's not doing those two things, it's got to go. And this meant even paragraphs I had reworked and reworked and rewritten and researched for ages. Just be ruthless, really ruthless. Just get rid of them. And then I think I wanted to find novels that were set in situations where the characters were in a situation of comfort, but there was something politically dramatic going on that they felt intellectually they should be involved with, but they didn't know whether it was worth the risk, right? So that sense of like, do I engage in this moment of possible societal um, um, importance, or is it just like, like a flash in the pan and I'm just going to end up in a worse situation than I was before? And I couldn't find very many of them actually from English language writers. The one novel I really admired was there's Flaubert, Sentimental Education, Education Sentimentale, is set in the 1848 revolution in France. That one was, I felt that anxiety in his characters, and also some other Russian novels, Tolstoy, bits of Turgenev were good on this, but mainly it was South American writers. And I think South America is a really, Latin America is a really important place for us as Palestinians to sort of look in terms of, because they've moved from situations of extreme authoritarianism and mass disappearances and genocide and bloodshed. And they've moved from that into a point of, you know, fairly dysfunctional democracies, but a lot better than, it's something to look towards. And a lot of their writers are these young characters on the brink. So I really liked Roberto Boliano. There's another writer called Francisco Goldman who writes about Guatemala. And actually, that book, I always talk about Frank's book because I read it when I lived in Cairo in my 20s. It's called The Long Night of White Chickens. And it's basically, it's a love story. It's like it's set in Guatemala, and it's one woman sort of telling her story in a cafe to a man. So there's a lot of like self-revelation, but it flashes in and out of different periods of Guatemala's history. But it's so, and I knew nothing about Guatemala before I read that book, right? I didn't know about the killings I mean, I had a vague idea that there was violence, but I didn't know about the genocide in the villages. I didn't know about the role of the Americans. I didn't know. But after I read that novel, which I was really just moved me as a love story, I um I became a bit obsessed with Guatemala every time I saw something in the newspaper. So my thought was that without of it was I wanted to do that, like to have a book that I can get people in on the story of a drama and a love story. And then from that, I will not be able to answer all their questions. I will not be able to tell the whole account. But for readers who are less curious, they will um, they will go on later and they will read books. They will see documentaries. So it took a lot of it took a kind of it takes weight off you to do that. Sorry, I'm just going to put this on focus. Oh. Hi, Fatima's joined. And Islam. Yeah. Do you have any, does that answer your question, or is there anything else? Was there something more specific you were thinking of? But I think
It
also
does.
what I was also thinking of with that book was I wanted to slightly blur the time period. I mean, sometimes people were very keen to pin it down, and a lot of the events in my Gaza was I was really trying to insist on people, listen, this is my Gaza, this is my vision of it. I had taken incidents from Jenin in 2002 and put them in Gaza because I started writing out of it in around 2003, and there hadn't been aerial bombings of Gaza, like of a hospital in Gaza, right? That had happened in Jenin. So I just wanted to put the work, like these different kind of extreme incidents, and put them in one place to get people to understand what it meant to be Palestinian, and put this variety of people from across the political spectrum. So because yeah, I mean, also talking about my characters in the Gulf, I felt when I was in the Gulf, you sometimes meet these Palestinians who are now like bankers and stuff, and they'd say, "Oh, I just, it has nothing to do with me," and I'm just, like they were trying to say, "I want a nice life. It doesn't matter. I'm just, I was political, but I'm not political." But then, if you spoke about anything that was happening in Palestine, they knew everything. They'd followed all of the news, and their body language became quite strange. They'd sort of scratch it. I mean, I felt you feel it. It's never out of you. This connection we have. It's not something that's just can be that, I mean, it's completely the opposite of what, the Ben Gurion thing about the old, old will die and the young will forget. Not at all. Not at all. And I just wanted, yeah. But yes, I get quite frustrated because there are some um I think some people have said that I wrote that novel about cast lead, and that's and the sorry, I hate calling it that. Sorry, the 2008, 2009 bombing. And the book did come out after that, but I'd written the book by then. But these things get stuck. People want to chain it to one event. But I think, and if I could speak a little bit actually about speculative fiction, because that's something I think would be maybe of interest to your students. Um, it's to make something, if you pick up on a theme, you think about this is where it came from and this is where it's going to go. And then you're just trying to find that pattern and to blend it into a form that is not too connected to specific dates. And you know, you could set it somewhere different to make that example. Or in the case of speculative fiction, you create a whole new world, where you can explore these ideas. And I was invited, I don't know whether you have access to this book in Gaza, but there was an anthology called Palestine Plus 100. No? No? Okay. I'll see if I can send you a PDF copy for your students,
That
because
would be
it's
great. Yeah.
yeah, the editor, she's called Basma Ghalayini. She's from Gaza, and her husband is Ra Page, who is the editor of Comma Books. And Ra and Basma asked me in 2016 to write a science fiction short story set 100 years after the Nakba. Okay? So we were all writing short stories set in 2048. Okay. And none of us,
Interesting.
interesting. So none of us had sight of the other Palestinian writers. There were Palestinians from the West Bank, from I think there was um, Neyrouz Karmout from Gaza. Uh, uh, anyway, it's a big collection of stories. And I set my story again in Gaza. Um, and so did Ahmed Masoud. His stories in Ghazi, and I think there's one else in Ghazi. And um, although I was quite resistant to the idea of writing science fiction because I don't really read science fiction, I found it so extraordinarily liberating. I have Because nothing in your future world someone can say that didn't happen. Historical fiction, you can play around with a bit, but the future is completely up for grabs. And the other thing I felt, I felt a little bit disappointed in myself when I read the collection, because myself and the two other writers who had work set in Ghazi had all imagined that the siege would still be in place. And I thought, well, the Berlin Wall was only like 25 years. I mean, I remember the Berlin Wall coming down, and we thought that it had been there forever and ever. But now it's like 25 years. It was nothing. It was a blip. And I felt that we as Palestinian writers, we really have to be able to think in a way that is not just down the indices of like going down the tunnel of pessimism. We have to really sometimes think, what could it be like? How could it be better? What are we going to do? How is this going to be reformed? What are we wishing for? What's the best case? And sometimes what we're wishing for is something really, in a way, I feel that it could be something almost quite banal. We're just hoping that everyone's sort of getting on with their families and talking about TV series and their, I don't know, their aunt getting married, but not having to talk all the time about politics, like what emotional state will we like to be in the future? And these could be something more emotional than but yeah, so I think in terms of, but for anyone who's listening who wants to write, I would say try different periods of time. Try writing something very close, try writing something using the I, about how you feel. Try writing something from somebody else's point of view, like in a letter form. You can also try writing as address, like in this Trinidadian novel I mentioned, at one point there's she talks from the position of an ancient wood, a forest in Trinidad, which has been pushed to the edge of the island, and it's the idea that there's a kind of spirit in the forest that is watching over everything, and she sometimes speaks in that voice. So don't be limited with your imagination. Keep it free, and in terms of subject matter. Second thing is try out different forms. I think the short story is a really good one to start with. There are a lot of fine poets from Ghazi. I don't write poetry, it's the one thing I don't do. Try also writing plays. Just see if you're just good at dialogue. Have a look at if you can find some plays that you like, and then you can like read through them with friends. Because some people have more of a knack of dialogue, and you don't really know unless you try it. And some people can recall dialogue very well. They can remember exactly what people have said in a conversation, which is such an important skill as a writer. It's not something I don't, it's something I wish I had more of. Um, and then, write a small film script, or just see where do you feel, when do you start feeling that this is something you're at home with, and that you want to come back to and work with. You want to come back to that document. And I would say in the early stages, and I'm not the first writer to say this, but when you're unsure of it, don't necessarily share it with anyone too soon. Just keep it to yourself, keep it as a private project, because, people can be quite discouraging.
Thank you, Selma. In academia, we've got a term that we call scholasticide. It's been there for some time now. Carmen Abulsi in 2008 coined the term after 2008 war. And scholasticide refers to that deliberate and systematic destruction of education and scholarship. And one form of this scholasticide is destroying archives, museums, cultural knowledge of the people. And this is what happened in Gaza, in fact. I mean, we had that Matḥaf al-Basha in Gaza. It has been destroyed. Libraries, public libraries have been destroyed. And so these are forms of scholasticide. Amid this scholasticide, what do you think, like young writers, like our students, what role do they have in terms of sustaining that knowledge production and writing? And do you see it as a form of resistance, as we always tell them, as a form of survival, that your voice is not silenced?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's so hard to be speaking. I mean, you always, it's so hard to be able to know what to say that gives enough weight to the fury that one feels at the level of decimation of these institutions and these cultural sites and these libraries and everything else in that's happened over the last 2 years. I think that the only way that you can reframe it positively, because we can't really go to, I think it was Edward Said who said, despair's not a moral option. So if we have to think about, okay, the fact that they were targeting the culture shows that the culture is important. They know the culture is important. The culture is being eradicated every second of the day. And by that, I'm taking a non-museum like approach to what I mean by culture. I mean, some are being erased and then being replaced, and it's being changed in terms of, I don't know, like my friend Ahmed Masoud, who writes a lot about Jabalia camp. He captures in his book so much of the way that people treat each other and the way that they eat and the customs and the thing, so that the need to capture these things, I think, is very present. So if anyone has the ability or the time, or they feel that it is something that they have space to do, to even just take oral testimonies from their relatives, or to talk about different things, different stages, and to record that, and then to find a way to make it creative. And something one writer, Maggie G, said to me, which always stays in my mind, is turn it into art a little bit and play with it. Like take the real testimony, but if you're thinking of doing something semi-fictive or more creative with it, like turn it into art and play. Don't be more you don't have to be as sort of, as long as you're clear that that is fiction, what you're creating, you can you can work with it a little bit more freely. I do think that writing is a form of resistance. I mean, I wouldn't take it as seriously as I do if I didn't. I think we are, if you think about how, and it was interesting for me recently being in like Mexico or Colombia, like how people coalesce around ideas of national writers or national symbols, and it makes people feel that they're part of a society with all of those sort of variety of characters who are caught within it. And because in a way, a novel is something like, it's a bit like the sort of psychiatric notes of a society. So if you have someone who is the national writer, they are somebody who you're all looking up to, and then you're all identifying with parts of, I mean, most people would be identifying with parts of the way that you're being seen back. So it's a mirrored reflection on yourself, which helps one to sustain, to console in a way, and to sustain one's own sense of faith, one's own like morality and ethics in terms of how one should behave at certain moments in time, and to think of the greater purpose. So I think it can work on so many levels. It's very hard to quantify it. You know, it doesn't seem as overt as other forms of resistance. And I was talking, I mean, you probably have heard of the Jenin Freedom Theatre in Jenin, which, you know, they Ahmed Tabasi was in London quite recently, and he was talking about how he just felt that, like, working with the kids in the theatre, making them able to express themselves, you know, that whole kind of the joy and actually sometimes just the fun around creating art in itself, giving people things to work on, to live for, to think about, to put their energies into. And with writing, it's all you need is a pen and paper or laptop. That's all you need. And you can create something so powerful that can resonate around the world. I mean, like um um with sorry, like with Rafi Alaria's poem, it's just, you know, it's become like an anthem at so many events, and it's something that people have rallied around. But I can see two points from the more free you are in your writings as a Palestinian, the bigger chance for you to be targeted by the occupation. Yeah, by the way, I have a question so far related to being targeted, actually. May I ask? Okay, the first one, you can ask anything, Ruba, to me. I mean, if you feel safe to ask it, ask anything. Yeah, I really know and appreciate the fact that I don't live under occupation makes me a lot freer in what I can write about as a Palestinian. And I also know that I have my father quite early on when I started writing, he said, I don't, you know, he really likes what I write. But at one point he said, actually, I don't think I should be commenting, because he wanted me to be free. And I know that a lot of people don't have families which are as supportive around them. Particularly for women, I think this can be an issue about writing about certain, you know, emotional, romantic, you know, other aspects of our life. It becomes more restricted. So I know and I appreciate that the level of being targeted is lesser. If your second question is whether I have personally been targeted, I've been, um, I mean, it's sort of, when I last tried to go into the West Bank, yes, I was threatened going through, but that was more to do with my work as an international criminal lawyer. I have had lots of comments. I think there's lots of comments on Twitter and social media, but I don't look at them. But generally, it's been a lot less than I thought it would be. The first review of Out of It the first review of Out of It was given to a guy who is one of the most ardent, most vocal Zionists in this country, and I don't know why he was asked to review it. And he couldn't criticize me for being critical of the Israelis, because the Israelis aren't really in the novel, but they're controlling everything from outside. So he was critical of my way of writing about women and my way of writing about the British. And he was so patronizing, it was unbelievable. He put the line at the top of the review where he said, aren't you a little bit too young for this conflict? At the time I was 43, and I had been involved in Palestine since I was 22. And I mean, it was just so sort of annoyingly sort of, yeah, patronizing, but not, I mean, I don't know. One really doesn't know how these things are going to happen or when they're going to happen. But nothing that would make me, I mean, I think since October 2023, a lot of us have kind of lost our fear in a way, because I mean, it's just, yeah, I mean, it's so, we want to use everything we have. So no, not me personally, no. A nice thank you from George. Well, thank you. Thank you, George, for coming.
Thank you, George. And guys, if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to ask. Ragad, if you had a particular question, please feel free to ask. Either you want to write it, or if you want to unmute and ask your question, you are welcome to ask.
Yeah, hello. Just
Hi,
to make sure first, am I audible first?
Yes, you
yes,
are.
Ragad.
All right, so to thank you for hosting us in this lovely meeting. Actually, I would like to ask about something that I heard it a lot, like similar stories related to that. And I want to know, I'm interested to know your personal point of view that if a Palestinian student like speaks about Palestine or the conflict with Israel, or even boast about it, they might have some consequences or even deportation. And I think this might also apply to some writers. So, what do you think about that? Like, if the student in a scholarship abroad in an international university, what should they do to avoid this one if they want to speak up or write something? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a really important question, and there have been a lot of these cases. I'm not of students at universities being sanctioned, and like Mahmoud Khalil at Columbia. There have been other cases. Like I say, you have to, I think everyone has to, there's no hard and fast guidance, because sometimes the nature of trying to scare people is that it's very random. So it's not like you think, okay, if I do this and I do this and I do this, I'll be safe, but you never quite know how it's going to work. I think it's also a question of where you are in your life and your stature and your, I can probably take more risks than a younger writer, I would say. It's just you gain a certain, perhaps you have more kind of, you gain more sort of authority, so you can speak more freely. Sometimes people have been targeted, like, actually she's of Egyptian origin, but there was an academic at a university here who put out some tweets on October the 7th or 8th that led to her being investigated by the terrorism police. And it was very, very, it was very violent, violent upon her and very disruptive, and really like this thing of people being targeted for what they write on social media is going through, I think it's taking off actually in England. I don't think it's getting less. I think it's getting more. And it's quite scary. I've actually just come off Twitter. I've decided it's just not worth it for the sort of benefit risk analysis for me. I don't use it very much, and I just I hate Meta as a company, so I've come off it. So I think the two main things you have to be really, really vigilant on are the laws in those countries about these sort of anti-Semitism and terrorism, and there's enough to speak about without crossing into those. And until you're in a sort of more secure position, you have to kind of, it's really not worth trying. Hard to give, it's hard if you don't know the specific, if I'm not advising one particular individual in one particular place, because each of them vary a little bit. but people are speaking out about Palestine, obviously, but it depends on the university. Some of the universities, it's very much that is the mainstream political thinking, and it's absolutely they're safe to do so. Others, they're in the minority and it's more difficult. So it's a lot of different balancing factors, but according to the jurisdiction. I hope that sort of answers your question. But with Palestinian writers, I do think, going back to what I said before, I think in some ways things have shifted. We're not having to argue about every single point. And what I find quite interesting is that the way that one is criticized now is not necessarily over the facts that you're trying to say. I do get sometimes when I'm giving talks, I've had people in the audiences coming up with um, Israelis or pro-Israelis, coming up with things like, what about the partition plan of 1947? Or, you turned down the opportunity with Oslo to have had more land and all this stuff. But to me, they feel like old points of argument. I mean, I feel like it's the same script that they've been using for decades about why Palestinians don't have a right, to exist or to self-determination. I don't feel that it's evolved very much. So, I feel that they're kind of losing that they haven't, they're not really able to engage in the narrative in the way that they did before, because they'd look ludicrous. Because I think a lot of like heavyweight historians, documentaries, have actually told that story, and that story is accepted. In the 1950s, when my father came to this country, people didn't even know what a Palestinian was. They were just constantly telling him he was lying when he said he came from Jaffa. I mean, now that would never happen. Some things have moved positively. Um, and I think on many levels they're losing the narrative argument, because it's not just Black Lives Matter, it's also like the whole decolonization way of thinking that was taking hold, in universities, and these other ways of reframing that, it's the legacy of Edward Said has really affected academia. And it means that a lot of the staff would be willing to, to stand up for the students. They understand it. They understand this now. It's the most divisive, but also one of the most talked about issues in the world now. So there is a higher level of understanding as a result of that focus. I think I can't really talk about the US though that much, because I'm not as familiar with it. I think it is, it's probably a bit more worrying there. Yeah.
It is, yeah. From the stories that we read about the US, it is more worrying than probably the UK or Europe in general. But that's a good question, Robert. Thank you.
Thank
Any
you.
other comments? Any other questions, guys? Martin, would you like to say a few words before we wrap up? I know you've been close to storytelling by our Palestinian students. Martin has been training some of our students on storytelling, and he has been encouraging them to share their stories and document their experiences. So, Martin.
I'll be reading your book next, okay? Thanks. Just letting you know that. And I was very impressed by Ruba having read it already. And we've been working together with a group of these students on writing. And we're coming to the end of this. It's called Resilient Voices, and students are preparing written audio and video versions of their narratives, and it's a very exciting moment. I don't really have much. Honestly, I've been really impressed by and moved by the work people have done. I've submitted a selection of the students' writing to the local literary magazine over here in Western Australia. So we're hopeful that some of it will get published. And we started up an online book club this month. So we've been meeting on Sundays to talk about Pride and Prejudice, that radical work currently.
Are you looking at
Yeah.
it? I mean, there's a lot by Edward Said on Pride and Prejudice, isn't there? About
I don't know. Is there? We must read it. So we must look at Edward Said.
well, I
And
think you talked about
we-
how there's a lot of references in it to like sort of slavery in the colonies. You've got the underlying economy under these very genteel lives. I'm not, of
yeah,
course,
it's a stronger theme in Mansfield Park, you know, where Lord North has clearly made his fortune through the the involvement in landholding in the Caribbean. Um, and Well, yeah, I mean, the other thing about Pride and Prejudice is it's set really during the Napoleonic period. I mean, there's all these soldiers. Now they're not there by chance. They're part of the what's going on at that time. So yeah. Anyway, thank you for that tip, and I think that I could do with some more reading of Edward Said, but your book's going to come first, and we're please, if you are interested, Selma, honestly, in reading any of their work, it's a wonderful creative selection of all kinds of narratives based on their witnessing and experiencing what everyone has gone through, including Ahmed. And Ahmed's written some interesting articles, which you may have seen over the last few months as well. So I'm more in um, a position of being a supportive reader of their work really at the moment.
no, well,
Thank you.
from my end, I mean, just to say, I'd be very happy to read the work. I also know I've got an event next week we're doing for Palestine with PAL Music from Bethlehem, and there is going to be a panel with some Palestinian writers and playwrights and Ahmed Najjar from Gaza. And I can, if you're interested, I will just, I mean, if I don't know if the students would be interested, maybe there's also Ilyas Matar, who's a playwright from, I think, the Nasra area. Um, I mean, it might be interested, they might be interested to hear from them. I can't offer their time, but I could, like talking about playwriting, what that involves, or different forms. If they want to have more people from the sort of creative side, I can see what I
That would
can
be
do.
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. And let me know. I mean, I have different sort of connections which sometimes sort of slip my mind, but just if there's anything you need, if I don't know the answer, I will know somebody who knows the answer. So anything I can do to help.
That's
Thank you
wonderful.
very
Thank you
much.
so
Yeah,
much,
that's
Selma. And
wonderful.
some of the people here in the room have written and performed poems and other narratives, and I'm sure they'd be very interested in having a broader audience for their work.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Martin. Guys, do you have any questions before we wrap up? Because I know this is longer than expected, Selma. We agreed on a 1 hour and a half.
Anything I can do to help, just let me know. And
Thank you so much.
if they have any specific questions afterwards, or if they ever read my book and they have questions about the book,
Sure.
I have lots of short stories as well. I mean, just yeah, happy to help in any way I can.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll have you
Selma,
again in the future.
if you have we're looking for something to read after Pride and Prejudice. So if you have anything that you can kind of put our way, we might be interested in having that in our book club coming up. So definitely.
Well, what have you read so far?
Well, we've only just started. We've only been going for this month, so we've just read Pride and Prejudice, partly because for various reasons. But anyway,
Yeah, you mean, would you like, I mean, not just my own, I mean, we can step away from my own work, but I mean, are there particular like maybe Palestinian books by Palestinians or
Yeah, I think we'll talk about it in our next session. But availability in a copyright-free version would be helpful for the purpose of what we're doing.
Mm.
Do you know what would be what I'm going to do is let me ask Ra. I'm sure he'll be supportive at Comma Press because they've got a lot of books which are by Palestinian writers. They've got Nehru's Karmut short stories. I mean, I don't know whether, I mean, with the idea of the book club is maybe if you just get a feel from the students, because I can see that there must be a joy to read something completely different, Pride of Prejudice, which gets you out away. But if they want Palestinian texts, I'm sure that Comma Press would probably provide, you know, versions that are free to be available to the book group as well.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah. It's really good to meet everyone. Okay.
Thank you very much, Selma. We look forward to having you again in the future, maybe very soon, hopefully.
No, anytime.
Thank you very much.
My warmest to all your wonderful students. Brilliant, brilliant questions. I mean, I remember coming to Gaza. It's like one of the most vibrant student bodies I've ever come across. That and I think the only ones which came close was Pakistan and India. And a little bit in yeah. But in terms of like buzzy questions and ideas, and really challenging questions too.
Thank you very much. You've been wonderful. We look forward to having you again in Gaza. It's safer and rebuilt hopefully very soon, inshallah.
Inshallah.
شكرا جدا سلمى على وقتك. Thank you for your time and effort. We really appreciate it.
Sending a heart.
Oh, that's lovely.
Okay, all right.
Thank you very much. Take care and thank you. Bye-bye.
Right, good night.
Thank you, everyone.